Good evening or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Sam Nasser, and this is the Azure Cleveland User Group. A little bit about the group. We meet every second Wednesday. The meetings are free of charge and open to the public, and we cover a variety of topics related to Azure, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. You can find meeting information for both past as well as future meetings over on meetup.com at the link listed at the bottom of the slide. Some general information before we get started. Participation is highly encouraged, and always keep in mind, the only stupid question is the one not being asked. So feel free to jump in with any questions or comments. We like to keep it casual but organized, meaning the floor is always open for commentary, but at the same time, we want to give enough time for our presenter to go through the slides and the demo. And the presentation is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube in just a few short days. Special offer from Manning.com. You can get 35% off on a selection of books at the link listed at the bottom of the slide, and that will be made available later in the chat window. You can utilize the discount code MTPCLEC21 to get the 35% off discounts. For tonight's presentation, we have Azure Landing Zone by Abdul Kazi. Abdul joins us from Toronto. He is the co-founder of Come Cloud with us. He's a cloud architect, and he's an 8-time Microsoft certified cloud architect. He's also a speaker, blogger, and mentor. And with that, let me turn it over to Abdul.
Hi, everybody. So thanks for joining. As Sam said, my name is Abdul Kazi. I'm based out of Toronto, Canada. So actually, the weather has been pretty nice. We were chatting earlier. It doesn't seem like it's February, but let's not jinx it. So before we get into the presentation, let me talk about myself. So I've been in the IT industry for almost 20 years now. Been working with Azure since 2017. I've worked with Microsoft Azure partners in Canada, and very active. So you can check out my blog. I've written about cloud adoption framework, Azure Landing Zone, a couple of other topics, and I'm also the co-founder of Come Cloud with us. And in fact, next week we're hosting a Kubernetes panel. We have 8 folks joining us on the panel next week. So if you're interested, feel free to join us on that one. So let's talk about the agenda for today. I know this is fairly high-level topic. So what we're going to go through is the cloud adoption motions. Why do people want to move to the cloud? Why should you have a cloud-ready environment? What exactly is Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, which is known as CAF? We'll talk about the Azure Landing Zones and Cloud Adoption Framework, and then the design areas. I'm not going to be talking about all the design areas because that by itself is a session. So I'll go over the high levels, and then Azure policy. I kind of want to relate how Azure policies ties into the Azure Landing Zone. So before we get into the Azure Landing Zone, let's talk about cloud adoption motivations, why people are moving to the cloud. So as you might be aware, the multiple factors why people are moving to the cloud. One could be they want to move off their co-location. So when I talk to my customers, either they want to exit from their existing data center, they want to basically move off their co-location because their lease is expiring, or there's a merger or acquisition happening. Now, keep in mind, when you move to the cloud, it's a totally different mindset and it's a paradigm shift. What I mean by that is cloud is an operational model, right? So traditionally, when we talk about IT, we usually would buy equipment on a capital expenditure, right? So let's say you're buying servers, firewalls, switches, networking, what have you. That is going to be based on capital expenditure. So you would buy them outright, and then depending on your company, you would be depreciating them for 3, 5, 7 years, right? Whereas cloud is really you don't own anything. You pretty much renting it out from the cloud provider, just like your utility company. So one of the challenges we've seen with cloud is because it's a consumption model, people don't realize that the cost is going to vary. It can go up and down. We'll talk about that. So that actually has to be accounted for. Um, and one of the reasons people move to the cloud is, not only cost. People say, okay, I'm moving to the cloud because of the cost. Yes, that is a factor, but uh, one of the reasons we're moving to the cloud is um, really agility, right, and security. I was talking to one of our customers, and they were saying, okay, we want to set up a Kubernetes cluster on-prem, and we're like, why? Because that doesn't really make sense, right? Because you want to be in the cloud, you'll get cutting-edge innovation technology. So that's one of the reasons people are moving to the cloud. But you actually also have to figure out how that is going to work, right? So I'm sure all of you have heard about the Ticketmaster fiasco that went a couple of weeks ago, or actually was a couple of weeks or months ago with Taylor Swift tickets, right? People could not buy tickets. So that's the challenge when you have mass people coming on. How do you scale? And cloud actually is the perfect opportunity to come because you can scale within seconds and you don't break it down within seconds. So the reason people want to move to the cloud, and depending on the use cases, right? So a couple of use cases I'll share. One is, let's say if you are doing test and development, right? And the project is only for 6 months. You do not want to buy hardware for 6 months, do your testing, and then the hardware is going to be just sitting there. So cloud is a perfect opportunity because what happens is you can do all your testing. Um, no money is tied pretty much because it's not actually capital expenditure. And then after 6 months, you can basically go away with it, right? Because you don't actually have the hardware. So that's one of the good reasons of moving to the cloud. On the flip side, the biggest challenge moving to the cloud is a different mindset and different compliance as well. And we'll talk about how that's going to basically look like. Because if you are moving from the cloud, if you're moving from on-prem environment to the cloud, then the mindset has to be different. Majority of the customers in the enterprise space, mid-market, would be coming from on-prem to the cloud. Now, if you're born in the cloud, then that's a different story. But obviously, you still would have to comply by compliance, or whatever regulations you have to abide by. Could be FERPA, HIPAA, SOC 2, so those kind of things. But you have to think about, before moving to the cloud, what exactly is the end goal and why should we move to the cloud. So talking about the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this, but the Cloud Adoption Framework really, which is referred as CAP, is really a collection of documentation, technical guidance, best practices, and tools that provide guidance for cloud adoption, right? So it gives you a best practice guide, if you will. So when you want to move to the cloud, these are the best practices. Kind of gives you a checklist of what you should be doing moving to the cloud. So basically, and the best practices which has been already done before. The three main elements of this is people, process, and technology. And as you can see, the circle actually is iterative. So keep in mind, cloud is a iterative process, meaning it is always evolving. It is going to be always changing. So let's say you move into the cloud for your one workload. Maybe in a year or 2 years, you have multiple workloads. You'll start again, right? Because depending, let's say the first workload was lift and shift. You did infrastructure as a service. You moved in. The compliancy, the business requirements might be different if you move to a platform as a service or SaaS or SaaS software as a service. So it really is an iterative process. As cloud evolves, as your business evolves, that is going to be iterative process. But these three things do not change. People, process, and technology would not really change, right? And that is really the main focus of the cloud adoption framework, where all these three entities come together to make sure that you have a stable and controlled environment in the cloud. And there has to be a balance, when you're moving to the cloud, because what happens is if you move too fast, then that could be an issue. Some people want to take their time before moving to cloud to see what the options are and what it's going to be look like when you move to the cloud. So with that being said, the cloud adoption framework has different phases of the life cycle. So the first phase is going to be defining strategy, right? So you would define the strategy. In this one, basically what happens is you have to justify to your executives why cloud makes sense. So they would be asking you like things like ROI, return of investment, TCO, total cost of ownership, how that's going to work. Why are we moving to the cloud? A couple of years ago, cloud was really a buzzword. Everybody wanted to move to the cloud without figuring out why they wanted to move to the cloud, but there really has to be a business justification for moving to the cloud. So once you define that strategy, then you have to start planning. And the planning actually is not only about moving to the cloud from a workload standpoint, but also the biggest challenge I've seen working with customers is skill set. Customers who have a huge on-prem environment, moving to the cloud can be a little bit daunting for them because it's a totally different mindset change. You have to think from the cloud side of things rather than on-prem. And cloud is very flat, right? What I mean by that is when you move to the cloud, for any service, for you to provision any service, you would have to enable compute, storage, and networking. Whereas in an on-prem environment, all those facets would be siloed into its own department or semi-department, if you will. So cloud is very flat. You have to you have to know how things are going to work in the cloud. So the biggest challenge when you start planning to move to the cloud, there has to be the proper skill set and there has to be a proper plan of adoption, how that's going to look like and who's going to do what. And then moving along for the ready state. So the ready state is, and this is where the landing zone is going to come into play. So ready state is going to be before you start moving any of your workloads, you need to set up the Azure landing zone or a framework, right? So you have to have a good foundation. So that's where the landing zone comes into play. The next one is adopt. And there are two ways you can do. Either you can do migrate, so you can do lift and shift, pretty much bring your environment from on-prem as is, or you can innovate. So you can use those 7 Rs, like rehost, refactor, those things, depending on what you want to do and where you want to go. Now, a lot of companies, what they're doing, let's say if they have a monolithic application, they're going into microservices now. So Kubernetes actually has kind of blown up. Everybody wants to do Kubernetes now, and that's the way they want to do it. So the other challenge is there is a lack of skill set for that. So you have to make sure that if you are moving in that direction, you should have the proper skill set, not only to land into the cloud, but also maintain it. But because just like on-prem, right, cloud requires quite a bit of maintenance as well. One of the general perceptions is once we move to the cloud, we don't need people to maintain the cloud. You still need to have backups. You still need somebody to make sure that the cloud is running properly. or the workloads are running properly. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on the back end. And then with the governance state, and the challenge with the governance state is, because it's you can get away with it. A lot of people do not put emphasis on the governance state because define strategy. You have to have a strategy, otherwise it's not going to be approved by management. You have to have a plan to show that how are you going to move. You have to get the environment ready to move your workload into Azure, and then for adopt, depending on you're doing lift and shift or innovate, so that would be done. People don't give enough weightage for governance, like what is the best practices, how is that going to look like, what is the IT governance. So that actually sometimes gets overlooked, and in the next few slides I'll talk about IT governance. So that should really be the focus when you are not only moving to the cloud, but once you are in the cloud, you should have a very strong governance policy and governance committee as well. And lastly, manage. At the end of the day, how are you going to manage your cloud environment? Is it going to be similar as your on-prem environment? Who's going to be managing it? Which teams are going to be managing it? How are the patch management going to be done? What are the SLAs? So those things have to be part of the manage phase discussion. So moving along on the IT governance, right? As I said, IT governance is crucial depending on the company you are. If you are a legal or regulated company, then you would have to abide by quite a bit of compliance requirements. So SOC 2 could be HIPAA, FERPA. If you are in Europe, then GDPR would come into play. And one of the reasons of governance is to make sure that your environment is secure. Next time you get audited, the auditors say, okay, everything looks good, and that should be good to go. And even from a landing zone standpoint, when customers, I work with customers, they're like, we need a SOC 2 compliance. So that piece actually gets fit into the landing zone piece, meaning, you need to put special guardrails for SOC 2. The requirements go up. So those things have to be accounted for when you are planning for the landing zone. So that's why, hence I'm bringing that up, is governance should be top of mind, and the discussion should start before you even start planning for anything. So keep the questions coming. If you have any questions, just interrupt me, and then we go from there. So what companies should be doing is, they should be aligning a cloud governance team. There's still lack of cloud governance team because the governance is still done either by the local security team or the local security compliance team. The challenge with that is the cloud governance is very different, right? So, for example, if you have a compliancy requirement to keep data in a region or a country, then you have to figure out, okay, how is that going to work if you only have one data center in that region? So, like in Canada, for example, AWS only has one data center region, right? So for high availability, they have to go to another region, could be US or South America. And that actually was the case with Azure a couple of years ago. So that's a big challenge, right? So from a governance standpoint, you have to think about how is that going to work, who's going to be accounted for, and these things have to be taken in mind. The other thing is the governance team would account for is when you're starting with cloud, you do not want to open the floodgates. So I was working with a large financial institution in Canada, and they set up a governance team. They were moving to the cloud. What they did is they did not open up all the services in Azure. So as you know, Azure has what, almost 300 services now. So they limited the services. Um, all the services had to be approved by the cloud governance board or team before they would uh, be gone into production, or any other line of businesses can start using it, because they wanted to make sure that those services are tested, and there's no issues from security, from compliancy, other issues before people start using those services. Because if you start using all the services, then it's going to be really a big challenge. So cloud governance really has to be top of mind. And that's why it is very much linked to the landing zone. So I'll take a pause there. Any questions so far? If not, I'll move into the landing zone discussion. Okay. So you must be asking, okay, what exactly is Azure landing zone? So Azure landing zone, think of it as a framework, right? So when you're building a house or a bridge, you need a strong foundation. So that's exactly what a landing zone is. It is going to be setting up the right environment for your public cloud to make sure your security is done properly, your governance is there, networking is there, and your identity is there as well, right? And uh, just to be clear, Landing Zone is not limited to just Azure. Landing Zone actually is also provided by other public cloud as well. So anybody moving to the public cloud usually sets up the Azure Landing Zone. I've seen this on the enterprise and mid-market. SMB customers, they get away with it because sometimes they don't have a stringent compliance requirement or security requirements, or sometimes they're wearing multiple hats, so one person is doing most of the work. But in the enterprise space, landing zone is a must, because different line of businesses have different Azure environment even. So for it to be coming under one umbrella, these things have to be properly set up. So how would you get started with Azure Landing Zone? So there are multiple ways of doing it, but one is you can use the Microsoft Blueprint. Unfortunately, Blueprint has been in preview for the last 2 years. I don't know when Microsoft is going to make it GA. So I do not recommend using this in production environment, because there's not going to be any support. There's not going to be any SLA for that. The other one is going to be using Terraform for Azure Landing Zone. Microsoft does a phenomenal job on the Terraform modules. You have all the modules available. Obviously, you can tweak it based on your requirements, but that's phenomenal. One of the other things I also recommend people do is start going through IAC, infrastructure as code. So automate all your deployments. I still talk to customers where they're still using click and mouse. The challenge with this is you might think, okay, it's easy and it's fast, but there's chances of errors. It's not automated. When you have to make major changes on a big scale, then automation always works better. Initially, it's going to take more time because you're building up all the modules, and then once you have everything built up, then it's going to be easy to maintain. So that's where a lot of people go. Terraform is used where people are, generally speaking, having multi-cloud environments. So let's say if they're using AWS, GCP, and Azure, they say, okay, let's do Terraform. If you're only an Azure shop, people stick with ARM templates or Bicep. A lot of people, go with Bicep as well. So that's another way of doing it as well. So now let's talk about the design areas for Azure Landing Zone. Um, I'm not going to be talking about all of them because I can talk about each. Actually, each of them would require a session by itself. So I'll talk about some of them like identity, resource organization. I'll talk about networking, some of the governance. So we'll go through some of that and feel free to ask any questions on that one. So as so the thing is, when you set up a new Azure tenant, right off the bat, uh, you won't have anything. You would have to set up your subscription first in Azure. Um, Regardless how you're getting your subscription, could be CSP, cloud service provider, could be an enterprise agreement, could be pay as you go. So once you set up your subscriptions, then you would start building your resource groups and then resources underneath there, right? So if you and people ask me this, okay, what is the least um, environment to get started with the landing zone? So I've listed the three at least minimum. RBAC, um, role-based access control, is least minimum. You should have that because I've seen people sometimes what they do, they start a subscription, all the users or all the people in IT would have a owner access, which is a big no-no. So that's why you need to take a look. And in the next slide, we'll talk about RBAC. The other one is networking. Networking is very important because, for example, the IP scheme, you cannot have a overlapping IP scheme between your hybrid environment and Azure, right? And I'm talking about the non-routable one. So that has to be planned beforehand because if you don't, then there's going to be IP conflicts and there could be a lot of issues. And the other one is naming and tagging as well. A lot of people don't think about naming convention going in, and then it's going to be hard to change. I've had customers where they started with no naming convention and they wanted to change it, and it was a lot of work. Like you can do it, but it's going to be a lot of work because on the subscription you can change the name, but resource group or resources, there's no way to change the name, so you have to recreate those again. So that's going to be a lot of work. And then for the enterprise customers, you would need governance, security, right? And then operations as well. You might even have a totally different team which does security or compliancy. So that's going to be under them. And then operations would be different as well. So it really depends on how big you are, what your footprint is going to look like in the cloud, um, and then how it's going to be managed. So let's take a look at RBAC, the the Azure role-based access control. So as you can see, you have the security principle, you have users, group, service principles, and managed identity. I do not recommend using users. Generally speaking, you should be using groups and managed identities. I was doing an Azure review um, for an enterprise customer, and one of their admins left. That person actually individually as a user had owner access. So the challenge is, um, had too much power. They didn't realize that his account was still working. So, in case if his account got compromised or something, then the person who would have compromised the account would have the keys to the kingdom, because being a owner on a subscription, is really a challenge. Sure, you might have multiple subscriptions, but the person might only be an owner in one subscription, but still, that's not a good practice to have. And then from there, what you can do, you can define roles. So there are built-in roles. And again, I do not recommend anybody assign a owner or contributor role to a user. There should be specific accounts that is not tied to a user that should have a owner or contributor role. For a user, what I would recommend using the built-in roles and the custom role. The only caveat with the custom role is you would need to have a Azure AD Premium 1 or 2 license. So there's going to be a little bit extra cost for that, but you can customize all the roles. And in the enterprise space, I've seen customers using the custom role, which really works better for them. So, for example, if you want somebody to back up your VMs, rather than giving them, the built-in roles, you can make a custom role for that person to back up the VM. Or if you, from your operations team, somebody has to do patch management, make a custom role for that person to do patch management and whatnot, right? So those things work very well rather than just using the built-in. Sometimes the built-in tools do not have all the functionality. That's why the custom roles work very well in those scenarios. And then lastly, the RBACs have to be assigned, right, from a scope aspect. So depending on what the scope is, you can or put the scope on the management group, subscription level, group, resource group, or even resources, right? So it really depends on what the task is and what the use case is, and then you can go from there. And from the RBAC to tagging, so tagging, resources in a resource group should always be tagged as a best practice. I've seen people not tagging resources. One of the reasons you want to tag is if you are doing an internal chargeback. So let's say um, you have Azure environment and then you have a separate line of business application running. They're using Azure under their own management group. What you can do is you can use tagging and charge them for whatever the consumption is going to be. Or let's say if you have a project uh, and you want to charge the customer for that, you can use tagging for that as well. So there are ways of how you want to charge. Now also you can also use third-party tools. There are third-party tools coming up now. A lot of companies also using what is known as FinOps, financial operations. So that can be part of the compliancy team, but under FinOps, you take care of the costing, and cost management is really becoming prevalent now because the challenge is people have used cloud now, but it's getting a little bit out of hand because the consumption is going up. Consumption usually doesn't go down, it always goes up, right? So the other challenge also is how do you control costs? So tagging can definitely help you from that front. And then tagging decision comes into play. How are you going to tag? What is the purpose? So as I mentioned, one purpose could be internal chargeback. You can do a internal chargeback on the for tagging. The other one is classification. The other reason of doing tagging is for classification. If you have confidential data, you have public data, private data, right? So you can do classification, and then if you want to run a report based on that, you can do that as well. So, or you can do tagging based on the environment as well. So if you have a production environment, all of those would be tagged separately versus if you have a non-production environment. And actually, I've seen that some companies are running a totally different tenant for excuse me, for non-production environments. So they have two separate tenants. Both of them are being synced together, and that's a lot of work. So it really depends on how you want to do it. But if you have just one tenant, you can do production, non-production, test and dev under one umbrella, and you can use tagging to make sure that those environments are separated out in case you need to call them out, or for chargeback or internal project. So let's say there's a line of business, you can have a specific tagging for that line of business, and all the resources would be tagged. And you can, when you run the report, all the tags for that line of business would show up. So that's a fairly easy thing, but tagging is definitely important to do. So now let's talk about networking. Networking, as I mentioned, it's really important. It's very vital. So, for example, IP address planning, right, is first step when you're designing a network in Azure, specifically if you have a hybrid environment to avoid overlapping IP address space across on-prem environment in Azure. So when you're coming from on-prem into Azure, then you'll have to decide, okay, what kind of connectivity do I need? So as we can see, if you're coming from on-prem connectivity, if you really need high reliable connection and more than 1.25 gigs, then you would go with the express route. If not, then you can go with the VPN. Now, what you can also do is for your main connection, you're using an express route, but for your backup, in case the express route goes down, you can use a VPN connection for you as a backup, right? Just not so that you don't incur large amount of cost, because express route is not cheap, and there are multiple SKUs with express route as well. So it depends how you want to basically design your network. But this is a great network decision guide where you would go through and see, okay, what are the requirements? Why we should even have do we need a hub and spoke environment or not? Do we need VNet peering? So that's another thing. Some people, let's say if they are using a web application, they would need web application firewall. So that's going to be another design criteria. Now Microsoft have, for the Azure firewall, there kind of three different SKUs, right? There's the basic, standard, and premium. So you'll have to figure out, okay, what services do I need? Where do I fit? Which one should I choose? Or I had an enterprise customer who brought their own NVA firewall. So there was a third-party firewall they brought in, and they're like, yep, we'll use this third-party firewall in Azure. We're not going to be using the native Azure firewall. And so that has to be planned properly, because when you bring those firewall on, sometimes you have, those firewalls, sometimes you have to start working with ExpressRoute, and then it gets complicated because then BGP comes into play. So those things have to be accounted for as well, right? And then not only that, but then you need to have the right skill set for the people who are going to be maintaining this environment. Because designing and implementation is one thing, but ongoing support is, always long term. So you need to figure out, okay, how are we going to support this in the long term, and how is that going to look like? And then from the design consideration, right? Like, for example, if you are using some Azure services, such as application gateway, web application firewall, Azure firewall, they require their own dedicated subnets. So you have to account for, okay, how many subnets do we need? By the way, when you're setting up a new subnet, it's going to go with a /16, which in my opinion is quite a bit. So you don't want to go like too extreme, and then you don't want to go too low. You have to also figure out, okay, what is the growth going to look like in the future? So kind of plan for the growth as well, because that is going to be a challenge. There's no way to change IP addressing, right, or subnets. So you have to recreate those subnets. So that has to be accounted for. And one of the biggest challenges in networking is the data transfer fees, right? Because people don't think about that. And the biggest challenge is you cannot estimate the exact cost. Sure, for other services, like compute, networking, even storage, right? You can use the Azure calculator. It's going to give you pricing, although it's estimated. It's a good estimate. But with data transfer, there's no way. You don't even know how much data is going to be coming in and out. Um, sometimes people get shocked with that pricing because they did not anticipate that cost is going to be that high for the data cost, right? And that data going out of Azure data centers between two virtual network has a cost. So again, you have to think about from that aspect, how's that cost going to affect us? That cost has to be budgeted as well. So these are the main things that should be uh, considered when you're designing the network. And the other thing is, this is not only designing, but some people say, okay, we really started small. We didn't think we would grow that much. We only thought, oh, we only have multiple workloads, but now, like after a year or 18 months, we have, hundreds of workloads and whatnot. Then at that point, you have to go and figure out, okay, how things are going to look like and start changing things. Because sometimes people don't plan ahead properly, then you have to go back and start kind of rewiring and saying, okay, backtracking and say, okay, how can we make this better? And then go from there. I've seen people that they did not properly plan for the right subnets, and then that was a challenge. And then there's so many services I can actually talk about networking for a long time because I see this quite a bit now. The other thing is DNS, and as we say, hey, if something goes down, it's always DNS, and DNS is so make sure you properly configure the DNS. If you're not using Azure DNS services, if you're going to bring your own DNS server, that's fine. Just make sure that that is properly set up because that's going to cause a lot of issues. Not having properly planned DNS, that is going to be a nightmare for your environment.
I have a question for you, Abdul.
Yeah, I saw the question. So that's a good question about planning for better subnets. So it really depends on how your environment is going to look like. What are you going to be doing with your environment, right? Like, are you going to be, and actually, I'll leave that, pause that question now. Once we go into designing the management group subscriptions, maybe there I'll answer the question because that might make much more sense. Because it really depends on how the lay of the land is going to look like from your resource groups and resources. Are you going to have just one subscription, and under that subscription, which are you going to be having multiple source groups, or are you going to be defining your subscriptions into different line of businesses, and then it's going to come through? So honestly, there's no good answer for that one, but we'll when I come to the management groups and subscription groups, I'll mention that as well there.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So yeah, I think networking should be covered. What else can I talk about networking? Yeah, I think, and some people think, yeah, they really need express route. You really don't need express route. If you can get away with VPN, site-to-site VPN, that should be more than enough. And Azure does a great job of connecting with the on-prem environment. It's a fairly easy setup. So if you're connecting your on-prem environment into Azure, that's good to be. That's going to be good to go. One of the challenges, obviously, is going to be from a compliance standpoint. You have to make sure that your data is secure in transit and in rest, right? So when you're going from your on-prem environment into Azure, your data is secure, and then moving into Azure, your data is secure as well. So that has to be accounted for as well from a networking and security aspect. So now let's talk about factors that influence the right setup. What exactly is going to be the right setup? And usually, the example I would give is one shoe size does not fit all, right? You have to kind of figure out, okay, what exactly are you trying to achieve? Why are you moving to Azure? And what exactly is going to be the outcome? So cost transparency, right? Like as I said, Azure is flat. When you go into Azure, you can just start spinning up services, resources, right? Any kind of services, compute, storage, networking, what have you. So you have to really have a cost structure. You have to have guardrails. You'd have to have tagging and ownership, making sure that people are properly trained and they are properly going into services that are needed. So, for example, if a customer spin up, or IT department spin up a new, let's say, N series virtual machine, um, or let's say the high level compute or the high end CPU virtual machines, that's going to be quite a bit of cost, right? So how do you control that cost? And the challenge with cloud is you get the bill after 30 days. So it might be a little bit too late to find out that you're already over budget. So policies, and we'll talk about policies at the end. How should you start enforcing policies to make sure those things don't happen? And one of the examples I usually use is limiting the family size of your virtual machines that can be provisioned. So you might say, okay, we'll only use D level. D series virtual machines or N series, or depending on what you want to do, right? Rather than people just going and spinning all kind of virtual machines, which is going to cost you quite a bit of money. The other thing is responsibility. That's important again, right? Like who would have access to what environment? Because depending on the environment, and we'll talk about the Azure resources. If you have a separate line of business, that line of business should only have access to that environment, right? They should not have access to other shared services like networking or backups or whatnot. So those kind of responsibilities have to be defined properly. And the other thing is, like on-prem, start with minimum access. People do not need more access, so do not give them more access than they need. The other thing is you have to think about how the third parties or partners are going to access information, right? So let's say if you're running a third party, if you're running a line of business and a partner or a vendor needs access, how's that going to look like? Are you going to be using any APIs, or are they going to be VPNing into the environment or whatnot, right? So those factors have to be part of the design and see how that's going to look like. And lastly, from a compliance and security policy, you have to decide, okay, how is this going to look like from a compliance standpoint? So, funny, last year I was doing an Azure landing zone review for one of the banks, and when I started, the bank actually sent me a physical laptop to review their Azure landing zone. I'm like, this is the cloud. They're like, nope, we need you to have our physical machine, and then from there you would basically access the environment. Because they were worried about compliance. They were worried about, okay, are people going to be storing data locally or not, right? Which in that case, now you can be using Azure Virtual Desktop. But the point being is, compliance is still paramount for a lot of companies, because they have to abide by regulations and whatnot. So that actually has to be part of the design factor. Some companies say, okay, you can only store your data locally. So let's say if a company is headquartered in the US, they might say, hey, we can only store data in the US. We cannot store any data in South America, the Brazil region, or other regions, or Europe. So those things have to be accounted when you're designing the Azure landing zone, because that's going to make a huge difference how things are going to play into. So all good? Any questions so far? Okay. So now let's talk about how do you organize your Azure resources, right? And this is an interesting question. There's no good answer, to be honest, with this one. Um, so as I mentioned, the first time you're going to be setting up a Azure tenant, there's nothing going to be there, right? And then you would enable your subscription, depending on how you get your subscription. You will have a root management group, which is going to be at the top. And then you could have subscription resource groups and then resources. So now the question is, how do we basically go by organizing all this? It really depends on the company, because the first thing is you have to have a naming convention, right? Because if you don't have a good naming convention, that is going to be a challenge for you moving forward. So people need to have a really good naming convention, which is going to be under your resource groups and resources. Yeah, keep in mind you can change the subscription anytime, and you can also change the management group as well, and actually the root management group as well. Although to change the root management group, you would need to be a owner there, but on the resource groups and resources, if you don't have a good naming convention, the challenge is it's not easy to change, meaning you'll have to recreate them and then move your resources into the new resource group and resources, which is going to be challenging and daunting task. So how should you really define the management group? So on the management group side, right, so the management group really is a high level hierarchy. It can be defined, and we'll see in the next couple of slides how you want to define that, right? So management group could be, depending on your business. I've seen some businesses define that as a separate line of business. So let's say you have a special line of business. You would basically take that, define that as a management group. Anything under, so the subscription, your resources, your resource groups would be part of that management group. Okay. Some people do it by department, so you can separate out by departments. Some people divide it by geography as well. So it really depends on your environment and the use case. The only exception I would say is there is a shared management group. So let's say if you have the networking, right? Networking would be a shared service for all the Azure environment. So that's going to be a totally different management group, but that would only be accessible by the IT folks. So that's going to be separate. But then the other management groups, depending on how you want to do it, it depends on really the use case and your organizational structure. Same thing with subscription, right? So if you look here from a design consideration, as you can see, there are two different designs here. The first one here is they're dividing the subscription based on development, lab subscription, QA, and production. In this one, it's HR department, accounting, and marketing. So it really depends on how your organization looks like, and how you want to basically go about. I would say don't make it too complicated, because then the challenge is going to be managing them. Think of this as, like we do in our old days, the on-prem Active Directory where you have the organizational units. If you go make an organizational unit for everything, that's going to be way too complicated. So same concept, right? Keep it simple. Take your environment and see what is the best way of having that environment. And the other thing to keep in mind, once you make these subscriptions, the access is going to trickle down as well. And this is the reason you have a management group and subscriptions, right? You can apply Azure policies, you can apply tagging. Obviously, taggings are going to be applied on the resource level. But Azure policies you can apply even on the management level. I do not recommend applying Azure policy on the root one because that is going to trickle down to everybody. Because sometimes Azure policies, you might not want to apply to across the board. But so that's why what happens generally speaking is you would have the root management group, create a different management group for different line of businesses, and then underneath it you can start pulling that off. The other question I get is single subscription versus multiple subscriptions, right? The larger the environment, the more subscriptions you would have. And depending how you want to do it, a lot of people say, okay, this subscription is going to be for production. The other subscription is going to be for test and dev. The other could be QA. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. And you do not want to do everything in one subscription. So I recommend having a handful of subscriptions, but don't go crazy. I've seen customers having 20, 25 subscriptions, and that becomes too much and too complicated fairly quickly, because then how do you manage that? Who's going to be managing it? Unless if it's totally different line of business, then yeah, but still that's too many to manage. So keep it simple. The whole idea of subscriptions is to make sure everything is aligned. And some people do subscriptions because they want to do chargeback. So on the subscriptions, you could have a subscription based on your line of business or operations and whatnot. So that actually should work out fairly nicely. And the other thing is, who's going to be responsible for subscriptions? Again, coming back from a governance standpoint, right? Who is going to be, because subscription, once you have a subscription, anybody can go and create a resource group and start creating resources, but not everybody can create subscriptions. So that's the other thing you have to decide, okay, who is going to be eligible or who would have permission to set up a new subscription. Because once the subscription is set up, then your consumption starts. So somebody really has to be the gatekeeper, that not everybody just starts spinning out multiple subscriptions and racking up, racking up consumption. So organized subscriptions, I've kind of already talked about it. These are the questions you should really be asking. Separation of duties. If you are going to be doing production versus test and dev, have different subscriptions. Different end customers could be different subscriptions, right? So you might have a production environment. Let's say you're a managed service provider. You can have different subscriptions for different customers. So, or different departments or different business units or line of businesses. So it really depends, right? As I said, it really depends on what how your business looks like and what exactly are you trying to achieve from a management standpoint. So hopefully this makes sense from a subscription aspect. Now the best practice for the management group, right? So management group, as you say, so in this example, what we're doing is we have the corporate IT, which let's say this is the root management group, right? Underneath that you have production, development, and QA, and then they're breaking it down even further: mission critical, protected data, whatnot. So again, you have to kind of figure out how do you want to break out your management groups, how do you want to break out your subscriptions, and based on that, you can build your hierarchy. And this is actually a great example of the governance MVP, minimum viable product. So when you start creating a MVP for your management group, you can go small. In this example, they're breaking it down with geographical. So, two geographies, and then the environment, even production, non-production, here, same thing. So again, same thing, right? Depends on the environment. Now, keep in mind policies, right? So the policies trickle down. If these are two, so let's say this management group is United States, this is Canada. If you're applying policies across the board on this level, same policies, that might be a challenge because some policies might only be specific to that region, right? So what you can do is apply different policy here and then different policy here. That's why the policy is showing from underneath here. It's not even going to the main business unit. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that when you're applying policies, you have to make sure what exactly are the policies for and how is that going to affect from a compliance standpoint, and is that going to affect the other business unit or not. So that is the governance MVP. Now let's talk about Azure Blueprint. I'm not going to talk too much about Azure Blueprint, and one of the reasons being is still is in beta, but Microsoft, has this Azure Blueprint really in a package. So what happens is you can create specific sets of standards and requirements, and you can implement services and identity and security and compliance. So these are the different components that come into play with the Azure Blueprint. So you will have your RBAC, you would have your policy definitions, and then obviously, the policy definitions, depending on how you want to define or enforce them, or you're going to basically just, I don't recommend enforcing everything, but depending on how you define the policies, you have the ARM templates, and then you have the resource groups, right? So these are the components, and then with the Azure Blueprint, it is going to manage your environment. Obviously, this is still in preview, so I would not recommend using this, but there are other tools. As I mentioned, Terraform is a great tool for deploying your Azure landing zone. And the biggest challenge with the first landing zone on the environment is going to be, your compliance. So as you can see, the architectural complexity and then compliance requirements. So obviously your policies are going to be the biggest one. So if you have to abide by SOC 2, you have to have more guardrails, more security requirements than if you do not have to abide by that. Like for example, you might have to have MFA enabled, which should be enabled by default or technically it's a best practice to enable MFA for all users, but for SOC 2, there are higher standards requirements. So that's the thing, right? With those policies, it becomes a little bit more challenging, but as you can see, the architecture complexity is less. So with compute, it's fairly easy. Storage and data is going to be fairly easy, right? Because you are already going to be, you can get that done fairly quickly. Once you get into the policy state, that is going to be challenging because now you have to figure out, okay, what things are being affected and how is that going to affect not only compliance, but the environment. So that actually has to be defined beforehand. Now, expanding on the landing zone, when you're implementing a landing zone, consider three categories. So the first one is going to be your hosting, right? So compute, storage, networking, and databases, pretty much standard. Um, Sometimes you don't even need databases depending on what workload you are going to be moving, because maybe let's say if you're doing IaaS, infrastructure as a service, your databases might be part of the virtual machine. You might not need those databases, so that might not be a factor, right? But um, those are things you have to figure out how that's going to affect the environment. The Azure fundamentals, those are the really building blocks, and those are the resources in the cloud that you would need. And then again, the governance consideration. How is that going to affect your landing zone from a governance standpoint? Because when the audit happens, you want to make sure that all the check boxes are checked. I've seen customers where they had a audit done and that the audit did not pass because the governance policies were not considered properly at the initial stage, and it was hard to implement because it was not properly planned. So if you plan it properly in the beginning, then that's less work in the future. And then these are the recommended practices for the cloud adoption framework. So these are the different fundamental networking, identity, storage, databases, and cost management. And then coming back to the question about how should we plan about the subnets. The challenge with the subnets is it really depends on how you are going to be using um, the environment, right? Because if you want to make it complicated, so I was having a discussion with somebody and they're like, we want to have Azure Firewall for each resource group and for all the resources as well. And I'm like, okay, that's going to get more complicated real quick. Do you really need it? All the traffic is going to be going through it, and the routing is going to be there. So that's a discussion, need to figure out, okay, why do you need Azure Firewall for all the resource groups? Can you get away with it? Can you get away with NSGs or not? And how many subnets do you really need? Kind of have to plan for that. Obviously, when you set up a subnet, it's going to give you a /16 IP. Do you really need that many IP addresses? The other thing is, what kind of growth are we looking for to account for? Because keep in mind, there are X IP addresses that are reserved by Azure, so you are going to be losing some IPs there. But honestly, to answer the question, there's no good answer. It really depends on the scenario because it depends on what kind of network are you talking about, what is the workload going to look like, and then that is going to be that would be a discussion part of the design. Yeah, so sorry, I know it's not a good answer, but that's the best I can do on that one. And then lastly, talking about Azure policy. So, and the reason I bring Azure policy is with the landing zone, it kind of goes hand in hand in the sense that Azure policy is a very powerful tool, and I see a lot of people still not really using it, but with Azure policy, you can really create, assign, and manage policies, which helps to enforce compliance and enable auditing for Azure environment. So you can really start comparing properties, resources, business rules, which are known as the policy definitions. And Azure policy, can be used to automatically remediate problems in the environment. So, for example, Azure policies can be implemented at various levels, as we saw there, right? So you can start implementing Azure policies from a management group standpoint, subscriptions, resource groups, even on the individual level. And Azure policies what you can do is So okay. Let me see if I can have scenario. Okay, let's talk about scenario then. So, for example, if you do not have Azure policy, what's going to be the worst case scenario there? So with Azure policy, what you can do is you can only allow resources types that can be deployed. So anytime a person is trying to deploy, you say, okay, with Azure policy, you can only allow, limiting the example I gave, limiting the SKU type of virtual machines to help controlling cost. The other one could be only allowing resources type to be provisioned in the approved region to enforce geographical compliance. So let's say if you have to abide by GDPR, only resources can be provisioned in that region. So you can enforce that with um, Azure policy. The other thing is you can enforce tagging and its value by Azure policy. So what happens is, let's say you're provisioning a new resource, a virtual machine, network, storage, what have you, any resource, and a person is not tagging uh, a value to that resource. Azure policy is not going to provision because it says, hey, you need to have that tag. So you can have a policy which is enforcing um, that to make sure that Azure policy is being enforced there. The other, the last thing I want to mention here is on the Azure best practices is I do not recommend off the bat start enforcing everything, because the challenge is if you start enforcing, a lot of things are going to break. I've seen where customers like, we're just going to start enforcing things. What you want to do, start small. With Azure policy, start with audit policies. That's going to audit everything, your environment. And then you can start enforcing policies, and then you can also start denying policies, right? So, for example, the Azure provision example I used, you can deny to not provision any resources except for the region that is allowed for. So again, if somebody has to only spin up resources in the Europe region because of GDPR, then have a deny policy where somebody provisioning a resource in any other region would automatically be denied. So you kind of have to be careful with the deny one, because I've actually kind of got burned out before with it. So be careful with the deny one. But with Azure policy, auditing is fine. You can do auditing, and then with enforcement and deny, you can start playing with it, and then you can go from there. And with that being said, that is pretty much the end of my presentation. And I'll open up for any questions.
Anyone have any questions for Abdul? Feel free to come off of mute or just enter them into chat. Seems like we have a pretty shy crowd tonight.
Hopefully I didn't bore you guys too much.
No, not at all. It was very informative, and thank you for doing it. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. Before we wrap it up for tonight, just have a couple of wrap-up announcements, and let me go ahead and share my screen. So for tonight, let me start over. Tonight's presentation has been recorded and will be posted on YouTube after the editing process, which usually takes a couple days. In addition, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel so you can get upload notifications. Also, we'll be covering a few technical events that will be posted on my blog. And again, please subscribe so you can get updates. And last but certainly not least, the feedback eval. The form will be made available into chat. And let me go ahead and take care of that now, actually. So you have a variety of links in the chat. And pardon me again for the technical difficulties. All right, so as mentioned, the recording will be posted on YouTube, and you have the links to both the eval form as well as my blog posted over into chat. For those that joined us a little bit after the start of the meeting, the special offer from Manning.com, 35% off using the discount code MTPCLEC21, and the link listed at the bottom of that slide is also posted in chat. With regards to technical events, on February 16th, which is next Thursday, is the Great Lakes Users Group for .NET developers, also known as GlugNet. And they're going to be meeting online, and you can find the meeting information posted at the meetup link there. And then on Thursday, February 23rd, is the Cleveland C# VB.NET User Group. And that will be also be held online with the link available on Meetup. With regards to conferences, there's a .NET Front-End Day 2023 that's going to be held on Friday. That is an all-day event from 9 to 5, and it is free of charge. And the link will also be posted on my blog. As we always like to do to discuss job openings, TechSystems always has jobs posted at techsystems.com/IT-jobs. And always like to ask who's hiring and who's looking for work. If you would please post it in chat or jump in verbally. And another thing you can do is you can also email it to me. And my email, snasser@nistechnologies.com. You can also find me on Twitter at samnasser. The link to my blog, as mentioned earlier, samnasser.blogspot.com. And lastly, if we're not connected on LinkedIn, I invite you to do so. And with that, thank you all for attending, and thank you to Abdul for taking the time to present. Really enjoyed it, and hope you all have a great night. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.